everyone, welcome to SEAA-Sons. SEAA-Sons stands for Southeast Asian American Sons. This is the show for exploring the experiences of Southeast Asian Americans through the lens of two Southeast Asian American sons. My name is Yang Lor. I'm one of your hosts, and my co-host is...
Hey everyone, Jason here. Welcome back.
All right, Jason. So it's been a while since we recorded our last episode, so it's good to be back on the air with you. What you been up to for the past month or two?
I just started freelancing again with IATSE Local 16, but good news, I just finished. It was only for a month because I needed to, first I wanted to test my skills, make sure I'm still able to handle the workload and the schedule, which I was able to, so proud of that. The earliest time I had to wake up was 5 because I commute, and sometimes the train, they change their schedules or they have delays. I worked on several big events. I mean, a lot of people heard of Salesforce, Dreamforce. There was Google next, and then there was TechCrunch. The interesting, a couple of things. One is AI is definitely in the news. So that was a lot of what the conference was about. But I actually got to work with Shaquille O'Neal. He came into one of our stages. So I got to... I was more in the back, but I was in his presence. So that was cool. How about you, Yang? What's going on?
Yeah, so this is wedding season. So I've been to a couple weddings the past several months, and these weddings are relevant to this podcast because they involve Southeast Asian Americans. So I went to, several weeks ago, I went to a wedding. Have a good friend who's Cambodian. He married somebody who's Vietnamese American. So we celebrated in the 209, the Stockton area. So 209, I think that the zip code 209 or area code actually goes from Stockton to Modesto.
Yeah.
And Merced as well.
Oh.
Okay. So when I said the 209, it might be in Merced. It could be a Modesto, but 209 here refers to the city of Stockton.
Yes.
And then I also went to a second wedding. This is through my wife, her friend who is Cambodian, married the husband, which is Filipino. So we went to a Filipino-Cambodian wedding. So yeah, I've been to a lot of Southeast Asian related wedding the past several weeks. Good to see different cultures represented. Music is great, and you get to see different music, different dancing styles. So I think I'm glad to be back home, and that's pretty much it for wedding season for us this year. Because I think wedding invitations are often sent out several months in advance, and those are our 2 weddings for the fall.
Nice. Well, you might be over weddings, but weddings are never with you. So always be ready.
Yeah. All right. So we are going to shift on over to our topic for today. We're going to be focusing on the experiences of another Southeast Asian American group. This is a smaller group that perhaps many of you have never heard about, or maybe you've heard about them, but you don't know much about their experiences. And so today we're going to be focusing on the experiences of Mien Americans through the film entitled Death of a Shaman. So Mien Americans are a group of refugees who originated from China, but they eventually settled in parts of Southeast Asia. The Mien Americans that are in the U.S. today, they are from Laos. In Laos, they fought on behalf of the United States CIA, just like Hmong Americans as well. And then after the end of the war, they were persecuted for their involvement. And so many Mien Americans eventually left Laos, resettled in Thailand, and then they were eventually resettled to other countries across the world, specifically here in the United States. And so the film we actually watched to discuss the experiences of Mien American is called Death of a Shaman. All right, so I'm going to read an excerpt of the film, and then we'll get into a conversation about how does the film teach us about the experiences of men in America. So this is the excerpt about the documentary, Death of a Shaman. As their father lay dying in a hospital bed in November 2000, Fan Fong Se Yang and her siblings gathered to watch over him, listening to his final words about walking through the mountains in his home country of Thailand. A shaman in Thailand, Yung Se Yang, the father, had been respected and treasured by the Mien villagers for his knowledge and wisdom. But like many of the Mien people who found themselves in the path of the Vietnam War, he and his wife and young children have been driven out of their mountain village, then picked up and transplanted to America, to the plains of Kansas, to live with an Amish family. From the time of his arrival in America, Yung Fong Se Yang lost his way, falling victim to poverty, violence, and a drug addiction that destroyed his family. What kind of man was he, really? And how could his daughter come to understand him? Death of a Shaman examines, often with painful honesty, how Pham Se Yang's Mien family suffered through a 20-year ordeal of racism, poverty, jail, and the murder of a family member. A chronicle of a darker side of the pursuit of the American dream that affected many of the 40,000 Mien who came from a primitive life in the mountains of Southeast Asia to the United States. The film is also a moving account of one daughter's need to understand her father's pain and desire to figure out what will placate his troubled spirit and her own. All right, so that's a description of what the film is about. And I'll just, as I mentioned previously, I gave a brief introduction about Mien history already. One of the issues that we run into with smaller Southeast Asian American group is the lack of data and visibility. And so prior to this podcast, I tried to search for information about population figures regarding the Mien population. And it was hard to identify any trustworthy data because a lot of the data was from Wikipedia, or you have organizations from, let's say, the early 2000s or the 1990s. And part of the reason is we don't actually we don't actually provide a box for Mien people to check when they fill out survey or census. This is not the case for larger Southeast Asian American groups like Cambodian, Mien Americans, or Laotian. When you apply for something, or when you are asked to fill out the census or surveys, there's often a box for you to check your ethnicity. Because of the lack of data, it's hard to find any good data regarding how many Mien people actually live in the United States. Okay, so with that, I'm going to shift it over to Jason just to kind of give us your thoughts about this film, and then we'll have a conversation about what does it teach us about the experiences of Mien Americans.
What stands out the most from this documentary is the time or the temporal setting. I think the format of the piece is nice because it's a documentary, but a lot of it starts with the end. The beginning of the film starts with the end. So that kind of tells you what you need to know about the title. But then what you get for the rest of the movie is a journey of discovering why it ended the way it did. So for me, I think the story has 3 arcs. It has the first part, which is about the father. The second part, which I would call her story, as in history, but her story. And then the third part is about the homeland. So discovering the past and visiting people. So that stood out to me the most because a lot of times maybe you want to tell a story like this linearly. So starting from the beginning of the main character's life, or the subject, I should say, Pham or Fong. So Fong starts with her journey in the middle of the movie, but I think that actually works well because you are hooked right from the beginning of what might happen, because you are met with a lot of curiosity or mystery. So a lot of times people don't really know what a shaman is, or even who Mien people are. So you're kind of met with some ambiguity, and then you're led into kind of like a sadness because, it's a death after all, but also the family, how they're dealing with it. And then it takes you to the journey. So you're really brought in, and then you're sticking with the journey. And then you learn a lot about, Mien people, her story, the dad's story. So I thought it was a great way to put the documentary together and then get people involved.
I think it's interesting because Hmong and Mien are very similar. We have a similar belief system, spiritual belief system. My family also believes in shamanism. So shamanism is a set of beliefs where that's predicated on these two principles. One is that spirits inhabits both, inhabits the physical, but also the spiritual world as well. So any physical objects, including people, have a spirit. And so that's the idea about animism. And then the other part is about ancestor worship, and that it's important for us to remember our ancestors because they affect our physical and mental well-being in the material world. Because we also, as people, we coexist in this physical material world, but also in the spiritual world as well. So I think for me, I've watched this film several times before. I watched it when I was a senior in high school, and I went to UC Berkeley for a summer. Shout out to the UC Berkeley Southeast Asian Student Coalition. They introduced me to the identity of Southeast Asian, and so we watched this actual film at that point. And for me, it was like the very first time where I actually got a chance to watch. It wasn't about Hmong people. This is a film about Mien people, but I saw my experiences reflected in the film. So it was a much more personal, emotional viewing the first time, because I think there's a lot of relevance between how I grew up and the experiences of the family and the film. But for you, Jason, you came from it from a different perspective where, you're Cambodian American, so your history and your culture might be quite different from the experience of Mien people. So it's great that it seems like you learned quite a bit about Mien people through watching this film.
So there is some overlap between Cambodian practices and Mien. I think it has to do with the shamanism aspect to begin with, because a lot of Cambodian religion is built upon other beliefs. So before Cambodians were Buddhists, they were Brahminist. I'm not sure what the exact term is. And then before that, it was like Hindu. And then before that, it was animalism. So it's a hybrid kind of belief system. But as far as the shaman system, there is belief in spirits or the ability to make calls into the afterlife or the spiritual realm and things like that. So I think what I was able to get out of it was that a lot of times maybe a belief system develops from culture and conditions or the way people interact with each other. So I thought that was a way to relate. But yeah, a lot of the practices were certainly unique to Mien people. And I think how it came across was some of the stories they talked about, some of the myths and legends and things like that.
This is the whole reason why we're having this podcast is sometimes we think we don't think we have a lot in common, but as you just mentioned, there's a lot of commonalities in terms of spiritual beliefs here, because whether it's Hmong culture, Mien culture, or Cambodian culture, people are often living in diverse communities where these spiritual beliefs are often intermingling. So what I initially thought about it as very unique or different, but you just mentioned how there's a lot of similarities. So that's great to hear. It's not just about experiences, but we also have a lot of cultural similarities given the concentration of Southeast Asian in these specific geographic areas.
Indeed. A lot of the other portions, I think, of the film is the location. So being able to showcase the landscape. And then, you see a lot of that in the later part of the film where Fang visits Thailand and the people. And that actually leads to the past, because a lot of what stands out for me is the theme is loss. So the father was lost as far as like his direction in life, because a lot of it was cultural identity that was tied into practicing shamanism and making a living doing, I think it was like jewelry or something like that, where a lot of the local folks might know what it is and have value for it, but maybe not so mainstream. So it was really hard for the father to make a living or earn to support the family, and it led to a lot of different societal issues. So the father probably would have wanted to continue being a shaman and living the way, he related to with his life, but due to circumstances and conditions, it led to his abandoning it. And then maybe you could speak more about that, because of a portion in the movie talks about the family structure. So his immediate family, but also his own family. But then also another aspect of the film itself, it's a documentary, but it also has interviews. So they did interview two people that were outside experts, you could say, and then they chimed in. So those were interesting to me, because it always feels like, well, why are they in there? But they have their perspectives.
I think the topic or the theme of loss runs throughout the movie. Coming to America, the father loses his sense of identity as the head of the household, as somebody that's dependable, as somebody that helps to navigate, protect the family. And we see this traditional role actually break down, beginning with living in America and not knowing how to navigate the system, and then an incident in which the daughter, one of the daughters and from this family was actually a victim, a fatal victim of a domestic violence. And then throughout the film, we also learned that because the parents were smoking opium, one day a son actually went to school and told the school about it. And so Child Protective Services actually came home and took the kids away from the parents, I think for at least several weeks or several months, until they went to a drug rehabilitation program before the kids were actually brought back home. And so there's this theme of like loss, it's like they keep losing more and more of who they are, their responsibility, their identity. And what you mentioned about the conversion. And so it gets to a point where, the parents need outside support, but in order to get that support from their relatives, they have to convert to, can't remember if it was Christianity or Mormonism. And it's in order to do that, as a father, he is a shaman. And so he has to burn essentially all the elements that he utilizes for his rituals and his custom. And that included a book where it traces back his family, I think at least many generations. And so in the film, they have these two experts, they're white American experts, who talk about the significance of such a booklet and how in Western society, we spend so much resources to protect such history. But that in this specific instance, something so valuable was just discarded in order for the father to be able to receive assistance from his relatives. And so I think this theme of loss is so critical to this film, because if you think about it, it's actually the death of the father that spurs the narrator's decision to actually look into the father's history and to actually go back to Laos and Thailand to learn more about her family history. And so it's interesting to me as we think about, what encourages people to learn about their history. And as an academic, I study a lot about immigration and about assimilation. So in American society, there's this expectation that, as you live in America through multiple generations, you start losing identity, you start losing cultural aspects and beliefs system. And some researchers have make the point that the first generation, like the parents, they often try to pass down the language, they try to pass down the rituals, they try to pass down the belief system, but their children are often resistant because they have to navigate both worlds. They have to navigate the immigrant world and the American world. And so typically it's a cultural conflict. And so the second generation, or the kids who were born here, they're just as resistant as well. But some researchers have actually found that by the third generation, children at that generation start thinking about who they are. And so that's the generation that starts to recover some of the lost aspects of their identity and culture. But in the film, we definitely see in the children where once the father passed away, the daughter is the one that seeks to learn more about her heritage. And so even though it's a movie about loss, it's also a movie about relearning kind of your cultural heritage as well.
It's, in a dark sense, you could say it's like a father-daughter movie because it is about both of them. And they relate together, actually, because the father in the movie shot footage ever since he landed. He bought his own camera, or he was able to obtain one, and he was like documenting his life. So he was recording. He was doing like an oral history. So he was recording his story through the camera. He would have done it typically just, with his children, but a lot of times they maybe weren't interested or it was hard to make time. So he was an early adopter with technology. So, we talked about AKA Don Bonus before with vlogging before vlogging. Well, the father here did the same thing. So I guess you could say Asians in a sense were forerunners to getting their message recorded, documented, and then put out there. In the movie, you see and hear Mien language, but also some of the types of prayers that are offered as a shaman. And then there's exclusive footage of, it's very personal history. So the fact that the subject was able to put it in here really opens up an aspect of life and then into her life, but also Mien life about what it was to grow up during that time when they first immigrated here. And a lot of that interest the father had influenced the daughter to make this film because she studied communication. And I think this film itself is a lot about just communication because unfortunately during her life with him, there wasn't much communication. But the fact that the father spoke through the grave to her and the family, that was another form of communication. And then the daughter making this movie was tying it all together. So without real direct effort, it does lead to a trajectory that allows this journey to happen. So that was a tool that allowed the oral history to be widely distributed to even other audiences.
Yeah, and I think the title exemplifies the essence of this movie, the death of a shaman, because it's really the father's idea, is really his personality, his identity that leads to the creation of this documentary. As you mentioned, he was an early adopter of filmmaking, essentially. He had his kids record him talking about life in America versus life in Laos.
Back to one point that I wanted to make sure we handle is the subject matter experts. So one was like a professor. I guess he was studying Mien culture or maybe Southeast Asian culture. And then the other was the linguist. But I do feel like there was a disconnect when the linguist was saying that, it was very important, that book. Like he said, he wouldn't have done that. He wouldn't have burned the book. But then it's a big disconnect for me because he's coming from a different kind of experience where the father, I'm certain he wouldn't have wanted to do it either, but his circumstances made him. So it does allow us to maybe place ourselves in a position to understand that kind of decision.
That just goes to the issue about people, you saying something based on principles, which is very abstract, and then somebody having to live that daily reality. When your choice is to burn this very important document to receive help or keep this and struggle, I think for most people, it seems like a straightforward decision making where it's like, I need help. And so I have to give up certain aspects of who I am. But yeah, I think it brings up an interesting point about, also the question about what's valuable. Do we need like outside legitimacy to tell us, our culture our identity is important for us to keep it? Or is it possible for us to reclaim or maintain identity and culture, even when the outside world pushes against that. And so definitely, I think these are kind of struggles that immigrants often endure, is to really think about, what aspect should they maintain, and which aspect is not worth fighting to keep, because there's so much obstacles that one has to overcome.
So in the film, it does allow us to learn more about Mien people and then her story, which is very specific. And overall, there's a lot of discovery along with the past. So the past, as far as the temporal sense, didn't necessarily mean what we think it means, as far as like something that no longer exists. So the fact that she was able to go home and then meet the people, it meant that it was still there because she was able to reconnect, but also it was what she needed as far as what was required to move forward. So you could almost say that it was actually the present or maybe even the future. So I think that was an interesting aspect. And then that took place later in the film. So, again, about the temporal aspect of, memory or death or even living, because she says that she feels alive again, or finally feels, has a new life. So from that comes life.
There's closure to this story. Typically, when we read a book or we watch a documentary, they have to end it at some point. But I thought that was very fitting with how the film ended. She goes back to Thailand, or I think even Laos, to the home village of her father to meet with relatives. And she feels a sense of closure. She feels satisfied. She feels like she knows who she is. And I think especially for immigrants, that's so critical. We feel lost in this world. Like, what's the purpose of life? What's the meaning of life? Why are we doing this? And sometimes it actually takes you kind of going back in history to understand what the future is like for you. And so I think this film is also useful for not just people who want to learn about Mien culture, but also just about identity. And we come across time and place where it feels like we're not who we are. And sometimes it's not about achievement. It's not about success, but it's about understanding the foundation of you as a person, as a member of a group. It's not about individualism. It's about this idea that you belong to a bigger society, a bigger group, and that often gives you a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning. And I think that's what she got from the visits back to the homeland. Is her father passed away. She was by this time already a professional. She was working for a news station as a reporter. She's established, but she still feel a deep sense of something missing. And the journey back enables to fill that void by understanding more about who she is, but also who her father is and who Mien people are.
That's great. I think that does a good review for the movie. I think at this time we could do our show specific rating system, our SEAA-Sons rating. So Yang, do you have a rating, a flavor this film has as far as what you think it might induce for audiences?
It feels like this film has two separate components to it. There's the first part of the documentary, which is about the descent of the father. He was an established shaman, but over time, he became a drug addict, and he's just difficult. He is no longer a father figure that was protective of his children, and not due to his own decision making, because he was they're placed in a rough neighborhood where he doesn't have the ability to navigate a new world, and his children are growing up in front of him, but they are facing issues that he cannot help them address. Or in the case of one of his daughter is the victim of domestic violence, and he feels he can't protect them. And so the first part of the film, I would say, gives you a sense, a flavor of bitterness. There's a lot of anger at the fact that it seems like no one cares about this family. They're going through so much struggle, and they have to figure out on their own. There's anger because of that. there's also sorrow and sadness because you see the family essentially disintegrating. People, the son, calls upon like the school to come and break the family apart, and the murder of the daughter as well. So I think for the first part, there's definitely a lot of bitterness. But I think the second part of the documentary, I do see it as savory. And so when we say savory, we reference that a film or a book is nourishing, it's inspiring, it's substantial. And I think that's where the second part of the documentary is, when the narrator retraces the life of her father in America, but also his life back in Laos and Thailand as well. So I think overall, it's like two different documentaries. Like the first one is very bitter, a lot of anger and sadness at what's happening to the family. And then towards the end, you see a much more inspiring aspect of the film, where the loss that the narrator experienced for the first half of the film, she's able to reclaim that identity, that culture, through her visits to the homeland.
For me, the film was really bitter. It was like super bitter. It was probably the most bitter film or documentary we've watched so far. A lot of it was because it just felt like there was a lot of pain. And that pain really comes through all throughout the movie. Like even at the end, it's a happy ending, you could say, for what it is. But you still feel like if they kind of had that connection before, it would have been nicer than having to get it after. However, it just shows that sometimes things don't work out that way. So because of that kind of idea, is almost like a bitter pill to swallow. So it's not bitter in the sense that it's terrible, but it just means that there's a lot of pain, a lot of sorrow, and sometimes a happy ending does come through sadness. The other part would just be, I think some topics or ideas were glossed over. So I think she spent very little time, maybe less than 30 seconds, talking about the Mien involvement of the Vietnam War with the Americans. So that could have been a little more contextual. So that could have, because a lot of times, that's where trauma happens, like right from the home country. So if you kind of don't explore that, it leaves out maybe a really important part that we don't see here, but from other stories, we know plays a big role in how people adapt here. So I think it could have been a little more in depth as far as some of the material. But for the movie itself, I think it really does show cause and effect, the consequences of losing yourself and what it means and the death that it leads to. The upside, of course, is that death doesn't mean the end. So it can lead to other pathways and your own growth. And the other aspect would just be the spirituality of it. So knowing that, ancestors, you are part of, people that came before you, but also that in the spirit realm, or, how you choose to believe it, then life can still persist in that way. So overall, though, I think the movie is very touching and heartwarming. So because it starts off so rough, the end does feel a little more satisfying or rewarding. The last note I have here is just that they may not have understood each other in life, but in death, they were finally brought together. So the distance they had has now become closer.
That's an excellent wrap up of the film, Death of a Shaman. And so we do encourage you all to check it out. It's available. Check it out. Learn more about the experiences of Mien American. And with that, we'll see you in our next episode. Thank you for tuning in.
That's it. See you next time.